But of course the big one, the flash and bang and whiz that really caught people's imagination was the sudden appearance of David Cameron back in the government as Foreign Secretary, and this sent everyone scurrying for their sort of boys' book of political precedents to see if there were any other examples of a former Prime Minister coming back into government this way, and of course there are.
You have to go back to Lord Carrington in the Thatcher government, 1979, to find a Foreign Secretary who was in the House of Lords. Of course, it's the first former Prime Minister to go to the Lords since Margaret Thatcher. And obviously one of the criticisms of recent Prime Ministers is that they've not stuck around Parliament to lend their experience to the institution.
Theresa May being the honourable exception, I
The
suppose.
honourable exception. I suppose Liz Truss is still there, but we will see how long. And he's coming back now into the Lords. He's actually, I think, the fifth former Prime Minister to return to Cabinet, having ceased to be Prime Minister, and the last one being Alex Douglas-Home.
Yeah, that was quite an interesting one. So Alex Douglas-Home, who'd been around in politics for an awful long time by the time he became Prime Minister. I think he was once Neville Chamberlain's parliamentary private secretary, so that's how far he went back. He actually had to renounce his peerage and contest a seat in the Commons in a by-election so that he could then become Prime Minister. Confusingly, he'd been Foreign Secretary, but from the House of Lords in the early 60s under Harold Macmillan. Then he came back in and was Prime Minister for a while, remained an MP, and then in his second term as a Foreign Secretary under Edward Heath, he was doing it as an MP, so it all got slightly confusing.
And Ted Heath had been effectively his deputy as Foreign Secretary when he was in the Lords in the Macmillan government. Ted Heath had been his deputy in the Commons. So there was a sort of symmetry.
You can imagine one of those Star Wars riffs now. You've taught me well, Obi-Wan, now I am the master.
So, yeah, quite. So yes, it took everybody by surprise, but I mean, I don't know. I don't quite know what to make of it. I think the idea that this is going to change somehow the political fortunes of the Conservative Party seems to me a bit unlikely. He has a lot of baggage.
Yeah, well, indeed. And I also think that people in Parliament incredibly overestimate the impact that ministerial appointments and small changes in the SW1 pecking order have on the outside world. I'm not sure that many votes, if any at all, will be particularly changed either way by the arrival or departure of David Cameron. So I'm a bit cynical about it, but from a parliamentary point of view, it's not as if that foreign affairs is a quiet area at the moment. So I think special arrangements may be needed there. I wouldn't be surprised to discover that David Cameron had very quickly picked up the phone to Alicia Cairns, who's the chair of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee in the Commons, and offered to do a monthly turn in front of her committee just to make sure that MPs were getting a chance to question him directly.
Yeah, well, the Speaker's already indicated in a statement to the House earlier in the week that he wants both the government and his officials to go away and consider the ways in which the Foreign Secretary can be held to account by MPs, because obviously being in the Lords he can't speak in the Commons, in the Commons chamber, so he can't participate in debates, he can't respond to urgent questions, can't make ministerial statements after major international gatherings or when crises happen. He can appear before the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, as you say.
But there's also the possibility that was floated when Lord Mandelson and Lord Adonis were running government departments, that maybe some way could be found where MPs could directly have a question time with them, maybe in Westminster Hall or something.
Yeah, I mean, I wrote an op-ed for the House magazine, the sort of Parliament's in-house magazine this week. We'll put it in the show notes, revisiting that issue. So back in 2009, the Speaker then, John Bercow, had raised the same issues about the appointment of Mandelson and Andrew Adonis and how they were going to be held accountable. Because there's a whole debate about whether it matters for David Cameron because it's a great office of state as opposed to their positions, which were not. But, I mean, Peter Mandelson was effectively the de facto Deputy Prime Minister at the time.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
And they're huge spending departments. So there were concerns then, back in 2009, about what could be done. And the Procedure Committee looked at this in the House of Commons and came up with a proposal that was essentially twice in a session, the Secretary of State from the Lords should come to the Commons and should take questions, 2 45-minute sessions in Westminster Hall, which is sort of the second chamber, if you like. It's sort of off to the side of the main chamber, just in Westminster Hall itself. Doesn't have division lobbies, so it only has debates. Doesn't have any votable business. Now, I think, frankly, for the Foreign Secretary at a time when it's we're living through a turbulent time, I don't think it's really going to work for him to be available twice a session. We live in an age of the urgent question. In topicality in the Commons chamber matters. And as Lord Carrington found when, unfortunately, the Falklands War crisis broke out, it was a real disadvantage to him to being in the Lords and not in the Commons. At the end of the day, if a crisis happens, who do MPs want to speak to? They will have an established deputy in Andrew Mitchell, the former International Development Secretary, close ally of David Cameron. He's going to represent the government in foreign affairs in the Commons. But if there's a crisis, do they want the mug key or the organ grinder?
I think that what they want is definitely to hear from the Foreign Secretary. And I think that what they're very, very keen to do is find a mechanism that allows the Foreign Secretary to be brought before them in whatever way. And something like the proposal you've just outlined may well be something that they simply can't avoid having, especially when you've got so many live international crises at the moment, and who knows how many more might suddenly appear.
Well, I think one option is they say, actually, Westminster Hall is just not good enough, and it's certainly not twice a session. Perhaps he should come into the chamber for certain pieces of business, not to be there on a permanent basis, but for specific items of business. However, lots of MPs, back in 2009, never mind today, lots of MPs were really unhappy about that, felt that only MPs should be in the chamber answering questions, and they were worried that if they allowed that, it would encourage the government to think that it was okay to create secretaries of states in the House of Lords, because the problem of accountability would go away. They didn't want to legitimise this idea of creating Lords ministers, Lord secretaries of state.
They've got to decide which of those two factors worries them most, lack of accountability or bringing the horror of bringing non-MPs into the Commons chamber. But one way or another, some kind of decision's going to have to be made pretty rapidly, I would have thought. Yeah.
And the other thing about David Cameron hasn't been talked a lot about is the baggage he has as, somebody in terms of his foreign affairs record. It's important to remember, I think, yes, he's known obviously about the Brexit referendum. There's the whole debate about whether the intervention in Libya in 2011 was successful, was a good idea, was a good judgment call. But for me, the one that stands out is the 2013. So it's the 10th anniversary since the vote on whether or not to engage with allies in the bombing of Assad's forces in Syria after they had dropped chemical weapons. And Cameron took that vote to the House of Commons. He put his judgment to the House and said, I think this is so important that we should risk blood and treasure, putting our armed forces in harm's way. And the House of Commons rejected it, his judgment.
It was an utterly extraordinary moment. And one of the things about it is that everyone sort of brushed it off. It was like a sort of dinner party faux pas.
Yeah.
This was a Prime Minister who said, we're going to war here. And the House of Commons said no. And then he sort of picked himself up, dusted himself down, and it was as if nothing had happened, really. And you would have thought that it was a resignation issue.
Well, I assumed that night that it would be, because I just couldn't contemplate the idea that a Prime Minister, having put his judgment on the line and having it so significantly rejected by the House of Commons, would just carry on as if it was any other old policy, completely normal. I mean, he was the first Prime Minister since Lord North in 1782 to lose a vote on military action.
Wow.
That
really is quite a statistic.
I mean, it was a significant setback. If you remember, of course, it had, I think, a knock-on effect in terms of our international reputation as a reliable ally. There are some who think that it dealt a significant blow, if not a death blow, to the whole principle of, in foreign affairs, of the responsibility to protect. Many people think subsequently that what happened in Syria, the terrible things that have gone on there since, happened in part as a result of that decision, because a red line had been drawn by the Obama administration. He then felt that he couldn't put the issue to Congress because Parliament had rejected it here.
I remember the headlines, the British aren't coming.
Yes, and then there was the sort of perception that Assad could get away with it and pressed on.
And of course there is plenty of other Cameron baggage as well. The golden era of Britain's relationship with China that he and George Osborne proclaimed for a while. And I do think that there is a kind of generic problem with bringing back an established senior statesman who's written their memoirs, because every time David Cameron says or does anything, we've got several 100,000 words of what he thinks about every subject under the sun that can be consulted. Has he changed his mind? Does he really believe that? It's all there in black and white. And I should imagine that the Cameron memoirs have suddenly come off the remainder shelves and become a vital tool for all opposition researchers.
Yeah, and the other issue, of course, we were talking earlier in an earlier episode about standards, parliamentary standards. The proprietary issues around some of the things that he's been engaged in since he became Prime Minister, the whole Greensill scandal. And of course, there's been questions about what he's been doing in terms of lobbying foreign governments and lobbying for foreign interests, particularly his close relationship with some of the Chinese ministers and business people, and what the implications of that are. So this is something that the opposition and the media are going to have a magnifying glass on.